Hello, Calaveras County. I'm Mike Taylor, and I got news for you because the sign over there says the doctor is in. He's right across from me, Dr. Randy Smart. How are you?
Hi, Mike. Great to be here today.
Well, this time we're going to jump into the World Wide Web and see just how sick we can make ourselves.
I think we are.
Yeah, let's take a look at the things people should and shouldn't do as they go online to figure out why they don't feel well.
So, the internet has become a really powerful tool for consumers and educators, and when it probably 10 to 15 years ago, the doctors realized that patients were getting more access to information. Now, it used to be a patient would come in kind of with no information. They would just say, well, my elbow hurts, or I have a headache, or I can't walk anymore. Mm-hmm. And we would go through our appointment and come up with an answer or at least a strategy. And then about 10 to 15 years ago, they started coming in and saying, well, what I read on the internet today is that my headache is caused by this, and therefore I have a migraine headache, and I want you to treat it. 10 to 15 years ago, that was very frustrating and very new.
I can imagine.
It was just a change of the way we normally do business. Mm-hmm. So in the last, 15 years or so, most of us in the medical business have learned that this can be a valuable tool. It should be available to patients, but it also can be a very harmful tool. Mm-hmm. And so one of the things the medical community is trying to do, really across the country, but certainly here in California and Calaveras, is to educate patients on how they might be able to use that internet in beneficial ways.
Mm-hmm. And I guess let's start with the good. So what are some of the best practices someone can adopt? Let's say they're starting to have occasional headaches as they get near bedtime, something like that, and you go online and search headache, and they're going to try and sell you everything from NSAIDs to aspirin to God knows what. Where should people go to find reliable information that they can trust?
Well, before I answer that, let me just tell you the scope of the issue is 75% of Americans use the internet for health data.
Goodness.
75% of us look at that for some sort of health-related issue. Mm-hmm. 30 to 40% use it to self-diagnose. So 30 to 40% of patients, big number, mm-hmm. right?
Yeah, that really is.
In Calaveras County, that's 20,000 people. Mm-hmm. Will go there to self-diagnose. So there are some really good guidelines about that. First of all, actually, it's interesting that you would use the example headache. If you go on your computer today and you type in headache on the internet, you'll get 31 million hits.
Goodness.
For headache.
Wow.
And the ones that come up first aren't necessarily, they can be the good ones, but they're not necessarily the good ones. But mm-hmm. 31 million, Mike, it's huge.
Yeah.
And so some of the guidelines are if somebody's trying to sell you something, mm-hmm. that's probably the wrong place to be.
Yep, skip it.
Right. There are websites that are very reliable. And in fact, the government kind of surprisingly runs one.
Sorry, not laughing at you, laughing at the government. But
the National Library of Medicine runs a website called Medline Plus.
Okay.
And it's medlineplus.gov. Very reliable, very good information, very easy to navigate. But that would be an example of a safe place to be, very easy to find. But many of the academic institutions now have very good websites. The Mayo Clinic has a very good website. Stanford University has a very good website. So many of the academic centers now realize the value of this. Johns Hopkins would be one, have an excellent website. So kind of the guidance is these websites end with a suffix, dot something, .org, .net, .net. And if you're looking for medical information, reliable medical information, you're going to probably want that suffix to be .edu, which is our academic institutions.
Educational institutions.
.gov, which are the government institutions, and somewhat .org.
The nonprofits.
Right,
that are,
exactly. So, but as you get out of those suffixes, you get into territory where the information is not reliable, in fact can be harmful. You can spend money, and it's so easy to be deceived, Mike. I mean, it is. I mean,
it really is.
It says, very good research, and we could talk about what that means, or natural. This is natural, and Americans like natural, man. They
love that word.
We could talk about what that means.
What does it mean in this context?
So a lot of these websites, Americans do like natural. They like having some control, natural. They don't want to be, tied to a pharmaceutical company. And so to call something natural really is one of the most unregulated things in our society.
Yeah.
So if you say something's natural, that means it has no food coloring in it.
That's it.
I think that's it. I really do. I think that's it. So some of this deception is they could say, well, my name is Dr. Jones. I have the treatment for memory. This is one of the best treatments we've ever seen. I'm affiliated with somebody, the Memory Institute, which doesn't mean anything.
Who knows what that is?
And my remedy is natural. I've got lots of research to support it, and it only costs $30 a month. And so a patient consumer would say, well, I have memory problems. I think I want to pursue this, and $30 a month and $30 a month, and it's what they're buying is garbage. What they're buying is not helpful, probably not harmful, but they're kind of being swindled, really.
They really
snake
are.
oil.
Yeah, it is. It goes back to the
Snake oil.
snake oil salesman.
Exactly.
Of
That's
the
what
days
that
of
is.
yore.
So natural has no restrictions. To say something has research behind it means nothing. I mean, because anybody, that's not a word that's very well defined. And of course, with good medical care and good science, you want research. And that's what the medical community really lives by, is research. But you could be one of these doctors that, or companies that gets on the internet, and you could say, we've done a lot of research. Well, maybe in fact what you did is you looked at two patients, in a non-academic environment, in a non-academic way, and said, well, it worked for them. Therefore, we've done research, and it works 100% of the time.
Yeah.
That means nothing.
On two people, that doesn't mean anything.
No, it means nothing.
Yeah.
Right. Right.
Yeah. Does, and I don't want to hijack this because this could be a whole nother show, but when the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, goes to approve a new drug to treat high cholesterol, and they're doing the trials, and so now they're to the point where they're testing this on actual humans. what kind of sample do we end up with in there? And I know it can vary, but usually we're talking about thousands of people who have used the drug over a period of time to participate in whatever research is substantiating that kind of research, right?
Exactly. It's a pretty complex design, but there are trials called phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Phase 1 just measures it to see if you're going to die or not. And phase 2 is actually looking at more at dosing and safe doses. Phase 3 are these very large trials that compare the new medicine with the best care out there.
Oh,
okay. And what you're looking for, if you're looking for clinical research on the internet, which I would discourage patients from doing because it's very hard to understand and navigate. But if you are doing it, you're looking for phase 3 trials from academic institutions. And those phase 3 trials have thousands of patients and have good statistical designs. And there's even what I regard as a phase 4. And I don't know if this has ever been formally acknowledged or not, but when the FDA releases a medicine, I wait. I let everybody else prescribe it.
Okay.
Absolutely. Unless it really has some life-saving implication, I let the rest of the people prescribe it for at least the first year. And when you do that, a lot of these medicines, they go, wait a minute, it wasn't as good as we thought it was, or there's a problem, your arm will fall off, or your liver will die, or...
There was a diet pill a few years ago.
Fen-phen.
Fen-phen.
And I'll tell you an interesting fen-phen story, is I worked in a department at the time that had 5 internists, 5 good internists. And so when fen-phen came out, this was the late 90s, the 4 of them started prescribing it, just started writing prescriptions. And you're working close enough that people know whether you're doing things or not. And so they come in and they say, why aren't you prescribing this? I said, well, I haven't decided yet. I'm still kind of waiting. And they go, well, it's safe. You ought to prescribe it. I said, well, I probably will over time. I haven't decided yet.
Yep.
And you could tell it really bothered these guys, who are smart guys. And sure enough, a year later, the FDA and the government said, wait a minute, we're hurting people. We're damaging heart valves. So the FDA, when they do their job right, can be trusted, but as a practice, I really like to see it out in the world for at least a year.
When we think we know what's going on, we think we know why we're having the headache, or maybe they've watched a show here and they think maybe, I'm coming down with shingles. Is the first mistake we make going online is we go online looking for shingles because that's what we think we have? Or do we go in and we put in symptoms and kind of play Russian roulette and see what comes up?
Yeah, I don't think it's a bad practice to try to access information on the internet. I think that's a reasonable thing to do. And honestly, access to healthcare has become more and more challenging. I mean, if you call today, it's hard to get an appointment. I don't care where you're calling, it's hard. And so you're not going to sit there and say, well, I think I have shingles, or maybe I have poison oak, I'm not sure. You're going to get online and look. And I think that's okay to do. But I don't think you should make your own diagnosis.
Okay.
I think you should try to get a sense of whether I have something serious or not serious, whether I need help or I don't need help. And I think you need to be really careful about self-diagnosis. I think one of the, if we didn't say anything else on our show today, I think the one thing I would say is the internet is not a substitute for a doctor's appointment.
For an actual doctor's appointment.
It's just not.
Yeah.
You know, you have to think about what we do, and most patients actually don't understand what we do. So you could come in with a headache, and what you might think we do is we look at a list of things that causes headache, and we go, it's probably that one. That's not what we do.
Yeah.
We watch how you move around the room. We watch how you describe the pain. We look at your history. You could ask somebody if they have a headache, and there's 4 different ways of saying yes. They could say, yes. Yeah. It's not very bad. Or they could say, oh, yes. That's a different kind of yes. Or they could say, well, Yes. Go, I'm not even sure he has a headache.
Yeah.
So computers can't do that. It's really
No, they
interesting.
can't ask any of those questions.
They can't really quantitate an answer like that. And so we do these things during appointments that I think patients have no idea we're doing. We're looking at how they're describing pain. We're looking at how they're sitting, how they're breathing. And so you can't do that on the internet. And I think it's wonderful that computers can't do it because I think it's an art.
Yeah.
It's an art with science. And so the value of that appointment should really never be underestimated. And the internet should never be considered a substitute for a doctor's appointment.
Now, one of our previous shows, we talked about getting ready for your doctor's appointment and having some probably questions that you're going to want to ask the doctor. You've had a couple of headaches over the past few weeks, or something is bothering you, this, that, or the other thing. And would you say that the internet's a decent place to maybe get an idea what might be going on? Or is it, just, like I said before, you're kind of playing a Russian roulette where you're just sort of shooting darts at an imaginary board up there that is trying to hit what's causing your headache?
I think you really have to use judgment, and you really have to understand the limitations. And when you look at 250 million people, it's hard to say it's the right thing for everybody. It's just not. And so I think it's okay to access the information. I think it's okay to try to understand what's wrong with you. But I really think you have to use judgment. There have been so many times in the last 5 years my patients have come in, and these are good patients. These are educated people. It's a great group of patients, but they've come in and said, well, doc, I know what I have because I looked it up on the internet, and what I have is polymyalgia rheumatica, and I want you to treat it. I go, 10 years ago, I would have said, get out of here. But now I say, okay, well, let's talk about that, and let's talk about what that disease is, but let's go back to what's bothering you. What is bothering you?
Yeah.
Well, I have some soreness, and I know that's this PMR disease, and I know you can treat it, and so you can use that information during your doctor's appointment. You can look it up, you can use it, and you can even bring it in. And patients are doing that now. They'll bring in a piece of paper and they'll say, doc, this is what I found on the internet. What do you think? Now, if you bring them 20 pages, that's probably not going to go well. We've talked about appointments and how to navigate appointments.
Yeah.
But if you bring like 1 or 2 pages, I'll look at it right when the patient's in the room and say, well, first of all, these people are trying to sell you something.
Yeah.
That's bad. Or also, this is a really credible site. This is from the Cleveland Clinic. It's credible. It's not what you have, but let's talk about what you have.
Let's talk about what you have.
How to figure out what to do about it.
Yeah, and it sounds like what we've run into is the human quotient. You have to have the human who's able to listen and, as you say, observe, even in that 10 or 15 minutes that we get with the doctor. He or she can learn a lot from, as you say, the way we answer their questions.
Absolutely, Mike. I mean, even when you go to a telehealth kind of platform, we still lose a little bit. Now, we can see the patient on the monitor. They can see us much better than email or much better than telephone, just voice. But even on a telehealth platform, you're not getting as much of the nonverbal. You're not able to see them walk around the room. I mean, you could make them walk around the room, but there's much more to a good medical assessment than just the patient saying, I have a headache. And we put much more into that. And I don't think we get a lot of credit for that, and that's okay. We don't need credit for it, but we're doing all this stuff, and it is the human quotient. You're exactly right. I mean, we're in there saying, well, wait a minute, there might be a cultural difference here, or there might be a value difference here, or his pain is different than her pain. You know, what you describe as 10 out of 10 is different than what she describes. And that is pretty hard to replace.
Well, we don't have the ports behind our ears yet where the USB plugs in and our brain tells the computer which codes are wrong, and they can look at the carburetor. So.
Exactly.
Now, I want to bring something up that I did myself. So I'm the guilty party here, but I earlier this year had broken my leg. And after that, after getting the cast off and everything and being able to walk again and kind of teaching my foot how to walk again, I ended up going online to look at physical therapy because I knew I wasn't going to be able to afford doing it myself, not having health insurance. So I looked at it, and I was looking at people who were physical therapists, as far as I could tell, especially because what I stumbled onto was some pretty good YouTube videos where this, I'll say clinician, because I'm not exactly sure if they were doctors, but physical therapists saying, you know, if you've had this, if you've done that, these exercises will really help strengthen these muscles, and that'll get you stable on your feet again, that kind of thing. So because we're coming at this kind of at both ends, I guess, because from the diagnostic side, we're not sure what's going on yet. I knew what was going on. I had broken my leg, so I needed to get myself mobile again and get my leg feeling comfortable. Do you see some pitfalls and pratfalls, no pun intended, in using the web for that kind of thing?
I think it could really have value. And so many of our appointments that have a musculoskeletal diagnosis is that you need to do these certain exercises or these certain maneuvers or this certain kind of rehabilitation. And I think there's tremendous potential for that. I would, and I'm not a physical therapist, but what I would say about that is what I've said a few moments ago, is that's probably not a substitute for a good physical therapy appointment, but it's probably a whole lot better than doing absolutely nothing.
Than doing nothing for it.
And you would have to use judgment, which is hard to do because you don't have anything to compare it to. But certainly if that's coming from credible sites, like the Mayo Clinic or Johns Hopkins or Stanford, I would have a lot of faith in that. And if you were to call my office and say, can I do this? I would say yes without even looking at it. And I think there's tremendous potential to do this because, I mean, you've got work, you've got a family. To go to a physical therapist is disruptive. And depending on the issue, I think some of that could be done through a YouTube-type platform and have a ton of benefit. But it wouldn't work for everybody, and it wouldn't work for every disease, and it would have to be from credible sites.
Well, and that's something that, and we've touched on it, just about everything can be made to look credible. You know, as we talked, the snake oil salesman, you know, sure, it sounds great. It's going to cure everything.
And they're very good at selling snake oil.
They're very good at that. And there's even a deal where if you buy 3, you get a discount, and so now you have a 3-month supply instead of $30 a month.
Or why not a 1-year
25.
subscription?
There you go.
Yep.
Where do we, and I'm going to say it because I'm guilty of it, where do we as the uneducated public, after answers, because it's going to be 2 months before we can get in to see the doctor, or a month, or even 2 weeks, depending on what you've got going on. So we're going to be curious, and we go looking for that. The credibility I have used, honestly, especially as we've talked about diseases and whatnot in the past several years, West Nile and things like that. I've gone to the CDC website, the Centers for Disease Control, and they do a pretty good job of, here's the disease, here's how it's moving, here's how it's transmitted, here's how humans can catch it. And yet it doesn't necessarily go toward the treatment side. So it does leave some of it still out there for the doctor to do.
Sure.
Where do you think we're making our biggest mistakes? Is it falling for the snake oil salesman, or is it thinking we suddenly have the MD after our name and we're out there curing all our ills? Because
So where would the consumer or the patient be making the biggest mistakes? Well, the biggest mistakes are not in your example, because the CDC is an incredible website that is invaluable to our society. I would say the biggest mistakes are from examples where people are buying things for diseases, and even subscribing to testing, all of which is unregulated and all of which is pretty much revenue driven. And that's where people make the biggest mistakes. But the probably the second biggest mistake is to try to make the appointments and talk to the doctor and make that connection. I mean, we should be more available, and we should be able to help people more. And but the idea of, when you go to the CDC website or some of the others I mentioned, I don't think you're making any mistakes at all. But if you take that a step further and say, well, I've decided I have West Nile virus, or I've decided I have Lyme disease.
Yeah.
I hear this all the time. Patients come in and say, well, doc, I have Lyme disease. So, no, really? There's not a lot of Lyme disease in this county. Tell me where you've been. I think that's potentially really harmful. And people do get hurt, not only from subscribing and taking stuff, but they get hurt from not getting the right diagnosis in a timely way, to where somebody is saying, this isn't West Nile virus. What you actually have is a neurological disorder that we should talk about, and timing isn't always important, but in some of these diseases, it's really important.
Several of them that we've covered here, it's been make that appointment now, don't wait.
Right, and so don't have I wouldn't overly trust your ability to self-diagnose on the internet. In fact, I would say nobody should really do that. And you might be able to do it in some cases where you have a cold and you get on the internet and you get on a credible site and you can say, okay, I don't have influenza, I have a cold, I feel pretty comfortable about that. You can do that. The other resource that is out there for patients is the nurse advice lines that many of the institutions make available. And so Kaiser and Sutter and many of these organizations have nurse advice lines where that nurse will walk you through and your symptoms or your issue, and he or she will say, look, you've got a big problem. You need to get in now.
Yep.
I know 10 years ago when I was in Air Force Doc, we had that available for the vets and the Air Force people.
Oh, wow. Okay.
So that's a resource that I think is probably underutilized.
Okay.
And could have.
So we're down to our last minute. So I want to show folks this again because this is the site to use, medlineplus.gov, one of the good ones. But basically, folks, Dr. Smart has told us there is no replacement for that doctor's appointment. So Dr. Randy Smart, it's official. The doctor is now out. I'm Mike Taylor. We'll see you next time. Be well.